Welcome to Washington Today for Monday, June 26, 2023. I'm Gary Starkoff. Thanks a lot for listening today. Russian President Vladimir Putin spoke to the nation from the Kremlin late this afternoon. It's his first words since the Wagner Group soldiers called off their march on Moscow. He thanked the nation for its unity and welcomed Wagner soldiers to serve directly with the Russian military. He also blamed the Wagner Group's moves on, quote, Russia's enemies, who he said, quote, miscalculated. We'll hear part of his address coming up. President Biden said today the U.S. and other Western nations had nothing to do with the Wagner Group rebellion. He added that the U.S. will continue to support Ukraine's defense. We'll hear what he had to say from the White House also coming up. And the Supreme Court is entering the last week of its summer session. Decisions that are expected this week include cases on student debt relief, affirmative action, and federal election laws. We begin in Moscow, where Russian President Vladimir Putin appeared on state TV from the Kremlin.
Сегодня еще раз обращаюсь ко всем гражданам России. Благодарю вас за выдержку, сплоченность и патриотизм. Эта гражданская солидарность показала, что любой шантаж, попытки устроить внутреннюю смуту обречены на провал. Повторю, была проявлена высочайшая консолидация общества, исполнительной и законодательной власти на всех уровнях. Твердую, однозначную позицию поддержки конституционного порядка заняли общественные организации, религиозные конфессии, ведущие политические партии. Фактически все российское общество. Всех объединило и сплотило главное – ответственность за судьбу Отечества. Подчеркну, с самого начала событий незамедлительно были приняты все необходимые решения по нейтрализации возникшей угрозы, по защите конституционного строя, жизни и безопасности наших граждан. Вооруженный мятеж в любом случае был бы подавлен. Организаторы мятежа, несмотря на потерю адекватности,
Part of Vladimir Putin's address to the Russian people, he went on to call the Wagner Group's actions, quote, criminal activity, which is aimed at weakening the country. This was a colossal threat. He said, quote, I thank those soldiers and commanders of the Wagner Group who made the only right decision. They did not go for fratricidal bloodshed. They stopped at the last line. He also said the soldiers would have the, quote, opportunity to continue serving Russia by entering into a contract with the Ministry of Defense or other law enforcement agencies, or to return to your family and friends. Whoever wants to can go to Belarus. You can see his entire speech at cspan.org. Back in the U.S., President Biden made his first public comments on the situation in Russia.
The situation began to develop as it did. I directed my national security team to monitor closely and report to me hour by hour. I instructed them to prepare for a range of scenarios. I also convened our key allies on a Zoom call to make sure we're all on the same page. It's critical that we're coordinated in our response and coordinated in what we to anticipate. They agreed with me that we had to make sure we gave Putin no excuse. Let me emphasize, we gave Putin no excuse to blame this on the West or to blame this on NATO. We made clear that we were not involved. We had nothing to do with it. This was part of a struggle within the Russian system. I also talked at length with President Zelensky of Ukraine. I'll be keeping in contact with him. I may be peeking him later today, early tomorrow morning, to make sure we continue to remain on the same page. I told him that no matter what happened in Russia, let me say it again, no matter what happened in Russia, we, the United States, would continue to support Ukraine's defense and its sovereignty and its territorial integrity. He and I agreed to follow up and stay in constant contact. I'm also in constant contact with our allies to maintain our coordination. I'll be speaking with the head of state right after this meeting today and making sure we're on the same page. I didn't get a chance to speak with one head of state yesterday. We're going to keep assessing the fallout of this weekend's events and the implications for Russia and Ukraine. But it's still too early to reach a definitive conclusion about where this is going. The ultimate outcome of all this remains to be seen. But no matter what comes next, I will keep making sure that our allies and our partners are closely aligned in how we are reading and responding to the situation. It's important we stay completely coordinated.
earlier today at the White House. Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin also spoke today. He called his army's action a protest that was not intended to force a regime change in Russia. Meanwhile, CNN is reporting that Belarusian officials said they cannot confirm if Prigozhin has arrived there following his deal with Vladimir Putin. And Luke Coffey, writing in Foreign Policy magazine, says, quote, Putin's disastrous decision to invade Ukraine has come full circle and set off an unstable power dynamic within Russia. He talked about this weekend's events at an event at the Hudson Institute.
Yeah, well, there are a number of issues that led up to this point. I would say the most immediate was the frustration that was felt by Prigozhin and his Wagner Group on the front lines in eastern Ukraine, probably not getting the support that he needed or expected, at least, for the meat grinder that was Bakhmut. And I think over a series of several months, this built up frustration. It is no secret that many of these oligarchs and power brokers inside Russia are constantly behind the scenes looking for their next opportunity to get more influence and power and to topple other members of the elite. And of course, Defense Minister Shoigu was clearly in Prigozhin's sights. So you then have this ongoing conflict that was meant to last 3 days or 2 weeks or whatever it was in the early stages, and now has been going on for almost a year and a half, with estimated, almost 150 to 200,000 Russian soldiers killed. And there's a lot of stress amongst the Russian elite that I don't think we have visibility on or that we see. We think Putin is safe and stable because he rules with an iron fist, but the reality is he must be under tremendous pressure to maintain this balancing act between these different centers of power, and Prigozhin is one of them. But in my opinion, the origins of what we saw play out over the weekend started back in 1991 when the collapse of the Soviet Union started. And I don't think it's finished. I think it's an ongoing collapse. And I think historians 200 years from now will write about the era that was the collapse of the Soviet Union and probably identify February 24th of 2022 as the most consequential moment in this collapse. And I think what we saw in Rostov and the Wagner rebellion march towards Moscow was simply a part of this process. And it's certainly unfinished business. Anybody who thinks that Prigozhin is going to cool off in Belarus and the Wagner Group is no longer going to play a role is hopelessly naive. We are in the very beginning stages of what I think will be a major power struggle inside Russia in the coming months. And depending on how badly or well, let's hope not, but depending on how well or badly Russia does during this Ukrainian offensive, I think will determine the speed and intensity of this looming power struggle inside Russia.
Hudson Institute senior fellow Luke Coffey. You can see that entire event at cspan.org. Also weighing in, former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. She also thinks the Wagner Group move will continue to be a problem for Vladimir Putin.
And now the problem for Putin is he has to explain why, after going on television in that 5-minute address, rather alarmist address about how it might be 1917 all over again and we were going to crush them and they were treasonous, and then you make a deal. And so I think one reason you haven't heard Putin speak to this is they're probably trying to get their story together as to how they're going to justify what has happened here.
As I recall, Putin's always been worried about this.
Yes.
Is that right?
This is the kind of Russian DNA to worry about the revolt. They've had multiple revolts against the Kremlin throughout their history. The most famous, of course, the one that Putin referenced in 1917 that brought down first the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union. And so there's always this concern that there will be a mutiny. And of course, they had the mutiny against Gorbachev in August of 1991. So this is not unusual. He's been worried about it. He keeps a Praetorian Guard to protect himself. But again, he really set this in motion by allowing this back and forth between Prigozhin and the defense minister and the chief of the general staff, by allowing an armed militia within the state that was not controlled by the state. And then sending them off into Ukraine and Syria and other places, taking advantage of their brutality, but now having them turn on him. It's like Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein, having created this monster.
A few people suggested maybe this was all a ruse, that maybe Putin planned all of this. What do you think of that?
Well, I think it probably gives them too much credit. At one point I thought, could this be staged? But you wouldn't stage something, I think, that makes you look so weak. Because really, dictators, authoritarians, rest on three principles. One is there has to be fear in the population. Secondly, you have to look invincible. Third, there can be no alternatives. Well, this has exploded all of those for Putin. It also has exploded his myth that the Ukrainian special military operation could take place without any effect on Russia, without any effect on the Russian population, and that it was a just and necessary war. Probably the most damaging thing about this is that Prigozhin said what has been unspoken by those who have supported the war, that this is actually a war that did not have to take place, where hundreds of thousands of Russians did not have to die, where 1 million people didn't have to flee the country. That, to me, is the most damaging thing that Prigozhin has done.
And here's former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, William Taylor.
This last couple of days has shown how weak Putin it really is. I mean, real cracks in his ability to govern. It also demonstrates the problems in the Russian military. And just as Condi Rice says, and as your reporter said, this is an opportunity for the Ukrainians. So this is what we're looking for in the next couple of days, next couple of weeks.
Mr. Ambassador, Brett Baer here. Former Putin advisor Sergei Markov told the Telegram on Sunday this. The entire world has seen that Russia is on the brink of the most acute political crisis. Yes, the putsch failed now, but putschs have fundamental reasons, and if reasons remain, a putsch will happen again, and it could be successful. Putsch is a word for a violent overthrow of a government. But what about that sentiment, and do you think things are turning inside Russia?
Brett, I think they are. I think they are. It's not just this last weekend's events. You all have reported, others have reported as well. A couple of weeks ago, there were these two other units, military political units that were made up of Russians, and these Russians coordinated themselves and with the Ukrainian forces. They attacked into Russia and went into Belgorod. So it's not just Wagner; it's these other and the support that Prigozhin got in Rostov. Is indicative that Putin doesn't have the support of the people like we thought he did.
Former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine William Taylor and former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice speaking on Fox News. And the status of Russia's nuclear arsenal, that was a topic at today's State Department briefing.
The one on the record statement that came out on Saturday was the confidence in the command and control of the nuclear forces. And I infer from that there is military-to-military communication, as one would expect, between us and the Russians, in contrast, obviously, to a different situation with China.
I won't speak to any inferences. I will say that I will let the Pentagon speak to any military-to-military communications, whether it happened or not. I will say, however, as the Secretary said yesterday, we do not see any change in the disposition of Russian nuclear forces and have not changed the disposition of ours.
And the Secretary did say in some of his interviews that Putin's influence, power, whatever, has clearly been shaken by this, by his speech, by the whole nexus of what has happened. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I will say, as I said a moment ago, this certainly was a new moment. If you think of the events of the last few years, as the Secretary said, 16 months ago, the Russian Federation and Vladimir Putin envisioned that Russian forces would be taking Kyiv. And instead, over the weekend, we saw Russian forces taking a Russian Ministry of Defense office inside a Russian city. We saw the entire pretext of this war being questioned openly, something we have done, something our allies and partners have done, something that you have not seen inside the borders of Russia. In fact, you can be thrown in jail for taking that step as an ordinary citizen inside of Russia. We saw Yevgeny Prigozhin directly questioning not just the Ministry of Defense officials, as he's done for some time, but really directly challenging President Putin's leadership. Those are all significant steps and a significant change from what we've seen, certainly in the last 16 months, but over a number of years. What that means going forward, we don't know.
Well, has Vladimir Putin, as you know him and as this administration knows him, tolerated this kind of insubordination, whether in the immediate future or long term? Would he tolerate this kind of challenge to his authority? I
would not ever want to speculate on how Vladimir Putin might respond to any event, certainly not an event inside Russia.
State Department spokesman Matthew Miller at today's briefing answering questions from NBC News' Andrea Mitchell. You can see the whole briefing at cspan.org. What might Russia do in Ukraine following the Wagner Group insurrection? Here's former CIA Russia analysis chief George Beebe.
Well, I think the biggest danger that Putin faced was that elements of the Russian military or intelligence services might defect, might throw their weight behind Prigozhin. That's something that Prigozhin was counting on. That didn't happen. And I think that forced Prigozhin to make a deal with Putin to get out of the situation that he had put himself in. The other danger was that the Russian military would have to divert its attention and its resources from the war in Ukraine to try to deal with internal unrest in Russia. That didn't happen either because Putin was able to orchestrate this settlement very, very quickly. But I think this whole situation leaves Putin wounded politically. Russians, I think, first and foremost, look to their leader in the Kremlin to maintain order inside Russia. And a lot of Russians, I think, have got to be asking themselves today, how could Putin have let the situation get so far out of control that this happened, this challenge to his power happened? He allowed Prigozhin and his Wagner Group of private mercenaries to accumulate a lot of unchecked military capability. And they grew hungry for more political influence in all of this. And that, I think, blame falls at Putin's feet.
Boy, some of your comments about how the Russian people view Putin now reflected in some of the headlines today. The Wall Street Journal, revolt puts Putin in weaker position. I'm just going to move that. Washington Post, Russian crisis casts Putin in a weak light. And the Washington Times and other papers, similar sort of tone on the future of the Russian president. You said that you viewed this as his most serious domestic challenge of his presidency. Why do you think he didn't see this coming?
Well, he should have. I think this was a failure on his part. He, I think, gambled that he could exploit Wagner and its private army of mercenaries to allow him to do things in the war in Ukraine that would not force Putin to rely on large-scale conscription of Russians, offload the burden of this war to some degree onto this mercenary force. And he gambled that he could do this and keep them under control. Well, I think in retrospect, that was a very ill-advised gamble. I think it backfired quite considerably for Putin.
Even if you've been watching the Russia-Ukraine war on a fairly close basis, it's still hard to get a grasp, get your head around what the Wagner Group is to begin with. Help us understand who they are and how they came into such an influential, not just influential, essential position militarily for the Russians in Ukraine especially.
Well, this Wagner Group, a private military band, really began in the Ukrainian war that, of course, got its start back in 2014 after the change of government, the revolution, the Maidan uprising, as they called it at the time, that put serious strains on the relationship between Western Ukraine, largely Catholic, Ukrainian-speaking, and Eastern Ukraine, largely Russian-speaking, Orthodox. And there was a civil war that erupted that the Russians essentially backed in the Donbass, in the eastern regions of Ukraine. And the Wagner Group of private mercenaries had its origin in support to those Donbass rebels inside Ukraine that grew in 2014, 2015. And then they parlayed that into activities in Africa, in Syria. And these were mercenaries. These were people who had experience as fighters, and they used it essentially to get control of mines and other natural resources that would generate wealth for Prigozhin and for other members of Wagner. This came to a head between the Wagner Group and the regular Russian military in 2018 in Syria, when the Wagner Group launched an assault on some oil fields that the United States military and its allies were defending in Syria. And at the time, the U.S. military had a channel of deconfliction with the Russian military, which was also operating in Syria, to try to avoid a direct confrontation there. And the U.S. commander on the ground said, hey, we've got a bunch of what looked to be Russian fighters coming at us here.
Right.
And his counterpart in the Russian military said, we don't know who they are. And the U.S. said, well, then we're going to fire on them. And the Russian deconfliction head said, fine. And that happened. And what happened as a result was a lot of Wagner fighters in Syria were killed by the Americans. And Prigozhin and Wagner thought that this was completely unacceptable, that they had been betrayed by the regular Russian military. And the tensions between Wagner and the Russian Ministry of Defense have grown ever since.
From today's Washington Journal, former CIA Russia analysis chief George Beebe. He's also a former special advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney on Russia and is now director of grand strategy at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. You can see that entire segment on the C-SPAN Now mobile app and at cspan.org/Washington Journal. You're listening to Washington Today.
Live Tuesday on C-SPAN Radio at 10:30 a.m. Eastern, Republican presidential candidate Nikki Haley, former governor of South Carolina and former U.S. ambassador to the UN, is at the American Enterprise Institute talking about foreign policy. And live Tuesday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern, former World Bank President and Deputy Secretary of State Robert Zoellick is interviewed by The Washington Post about Ukraine's economy and plans for reconstruction after the war with Russia ends. Listen to C-SPAN anywhere on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app or on your smart speaker. Say play C-SPAN Radio.
Welcome back to Washington Today. This is the last week of the Supreme Court's summer session, with decisions pending on high-profile cases including President Biden's student loan forgiveness plan, affirmative action in college admissions, and whether state legislatures have exclusive authority to set federal election rules under the Constitution. The court announced today 2 dismissals. The first was an appeal by Louisiana's Secretary of State defending the state's congressional map. That map had been challenged by black voters as discriminatory. The court's decision could put the state on track to have 2 majority black congressional districts in the next election instead of just 1. The court also dismissed an appeal on a lower court opinion that allowed for a handful of members of Congress to sue a government agency for records related to the Washington, D.C. hotel once owned by former President Trump. That decision was likely because the lawmakers were no longer pursuing the case. At the White House, President Biden today announced a $40 billion investment in expanding internet access. The event was part of the administration's Investing in America tour.
Today, Kamala and I are making an equally historic investment to connect everyone in America to high-speed internet by an affordable high-speed internet by 2030. It's the biggest investment in high-speed internet ever, because for today's economy to work for everyone, internet access is just as important as electricity was, or water, or other basic services. Think of the parents and students sitting outside of McDonald's or outside your office, be able to get on the internet in a parking lot just so their child can go online to do their homework. Just heard from Jeff, who has to drive his kids all over town to find a good internet connection. But he's not alone in that. There's thousands of Americans doing the same thing. or small business owners are not able to reach more customers, or seniors unable to talk to their doctor through telemedicine. For around 24 million Americans across this country, there's no high-speed internet. And for millions more, the internet connection is limited or unreliable. High-speed internet isn't a luxury anymore, it's become an absolute necessity. That's why we acted as soon as we did, as soon as we came to office with the American Rescue Plan. It included $25 billion for high-speed internet in places where it was out of reach, for schools and libraries to help students connect to the internet if they couldn't do it at home. After that, we signed the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, a once-in-a-generation investment to rebuild roads, bridges, ports, airports, and deliver water and high-speed internet to every American. And again, Joe, thank you for your help on that. To date, over 35,000 projects are either funded or already underway across the country, thanks to that law. This includes hundreds of high-speed internet projects in rural and tribal communities. But, it's not enough to have access. You need affordability in addition to access. That's why we worked with internet service providers to bring down prices for Americans struggling with internet payments. It's called the Affordable Connectivity Program. It's helping 19 million families save around $30 a month on their internet bills, and some save a lot more. These savings matters in homes like the one I grew up in. That's money you can go for groceries, for the electric bill, for other things, other necessities. Kamala has traveled across the country working with state and local officials to make sure people know about this program. And several groups and companies here today have helped millions of Americans sign up through the Online for All campaign. Online for All campaign.
Today's White House announcement starts a series of events over the next 3 weeks promoting the president's legislative wins on infrastructure, the economy, and climate change. You can see this entire event at cspan.org. Campaign 2024 coverage now. Republican presidential candidate Ron DeSantis was in Eagle Pass, Texas today, talking about his border security plan at a town hall event held at a veteran social club.
Part of what we're going to do, of course, we talk about, building the wall. I was in Arizona the other day, and, you have like wall, then it just kind of stops. And so you have like the guy from the cartel just kind of hangs out where it stops, and he motions for people, to go over. And so like having just one piece, I mean, you got to finish the job, and there's a lot more you got to do on that. But even in places where there were really serious steel beams and everything, these guys in the cartels, they can cut through the really fortified steel beams. And I'm just thinking to myself, you spend all this money on that, and you just let them cut through with impunity and do it. And so, I think you need adequate rules of engagement so that, if someone was breaking into your house, you would repel them with the use of force, right? But yet if they have drugs, these backpacks, and they're going in and they're cutting through an enforced structure, we're just supposed to let them in? I say use force to repel them. If you do that one time, they will never do it again. So this is, and look, here's the thing with the drugs, I think, is you are seeing, it's the #1 cause of death, fentanyl overdose, for people 18 to 49 right now in the United States of America. It shows no signs of abating, and it's going to continue to be a major issue. Now, you got to deal with the supply. It's not the only thing you have to deal with, but you have to deal with the supply. And so we're going to be leaning in against these drug cartels. I think that they are killing a lot of Americans. They are effectively in control of this border to begin with. And part of the reason it's gotten this way is they don't get any pushback. They're able to just do this with impunity. And so we will designate them either a transnational criminal organization, foreign terrorist organization. Chip and I are talking about. Bottom line is we're going to give them a designation so that we can unleash more federal power to be able to kneecap the cartels. And so that's going to happen. It's important.
Republican presidential candidate Ron DeSantis talking about border security today in Texas. That whole event is also available at cspan.org. Over on the Democratic side, Delaware State Senator Sarah McBride announced her candidacy for her state's at-large congressional seat today. The 32-year-old is running to replace Lisa Blunt Rochester, who announced last week that she is running for the U.S. Senate seat vacated by the retiring Tom Carper. Here's part of Sarah McBride's announcement video.
One of the questions that I get asked the most is, what does it take to make government work better for people? Some people say it's compassion for others, a willingness to work with anyone, or having a thick skin. That's all true. And for me, it definitely takes one more thing: my morning coffee. Every day I get up and go to work. My job is to represent 50,000 of my neighbors. It can be tough out there. Too many politicians want to divide us, to tell us that teachers, doctors, even our own neighbors are the enemy. Blocking out the noise and focusing on what actually matters isn't easy. That part takes more than coffee. It takes guts and a backbone. That's how we finally got paid family and medical leave in Delaware. For years, working people had to choose between their job and supporting a family member with cancer, between their paycheck and spending a few weeks with their newborn child. So, I ran for the state Senate to change that. We listened to unions and small business owners, brought people together, stood up to some big lobbyists, and got it done. This law is a good start, but government should do more to make it easier for people to raise a family. So I'm running for Congress. My commitment is to the people in Delaware who aren't seen, who don't shout the loudest or fund political campaigns. Parents busy raising their children. Seniors worried about paying for prescription drugs. Working people struggling to keep up. Everyone deserves a member of Congress who sees them and who respects them. Making a difference in Congress will take a lot of hard work and a lot of coffee. I hope you'll join me.
Now some video from Sarah McBride declaring her candidacy for Delaware's at-large congressional seat. If elected, she would become the first trans person ever elected to federal office. She will also be the youngest person elected to federal office in Delaware since Joe Biden's first Senate win in 1972. You can find more Campaign 2024 coverage, including announcements, meet and greet speeches, and other events on the C-SPAN Now mobile app and at cspan.org. That's also where you can find this program as a podcast. It's also available wherever you get your favorite podcasts. And if you'd like more on the stories that are shaping Washington, subscribe to our evening newsletter, word for word. Go to cspan.org/connect to subscribe. I'm Gary Sterkoff. Thanks a lot for listening today to Washington Today.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal, our live forum involving you to discuss the latest issues in government, politics, and public policy, from Washington to across the country. Coming up Tuesday morning, Center for Growth and Opportunity Senior Research Fellow and former Federal Trade Commission Chief Technologist Neil Chilson discusses the future of artificial intelligence. And then The Nation magazine's Amy Littlefield talks about abortion access in the U.S. since the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision last summer that overturned Roe v. Wade. C-SPAN's Washington Journal join in the conversation live at 7 Eastern Tuesday morning on C-SPAN, C-SPAN Now, or online at cspan.org.